Thomas Whitmore stood on his front porch watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains orange and red. The sight would have been beautiful if his heart wasn't so heavy. 3 years had passed since his wife Elizabeth died, giving birth to their third child, and every day felt like a struggle. His ranch, once the pride of the valley, now looked tired and worn. The fences needed fixing, the barn roof leaked, and weeds grew where vegetables should have been. But the hardest part wasn't the failing ranch. It was watching his 3 children grow up without their mother. Little Annie, now 4 years old, still asked for Mama every night. 7-year-old Benjamin tried to act like the man of the house, but Thomas could see the sadness in his boy's eyes. And baby Ruth, now 3, barely remembered her mother at all. The children needed more than Thomas could give them, working from sunrise to sunset just to keep food on the table. The neighbors meant well, but their help came with whispers and judgment. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch would bring casseroles and stay to lecture Thomas about finding a new wife. The men at the general store would shake their heads and talk about how a man couldn't raise children alone. Even the preacher had started dropping hints about the importance of a mother's touch in a Christian home. Thomas knew they were right, but how could he find a wife in a town where every available woman was either too young or already spoken for? That's when he saw the advertisement in the Denver newspaper that Charlie Morrison had left behind at the store. Refined lady seeks correspondence with gentlemen of good character for possible matrimony. Excellent cook, skilled in household management, fond of children. Margaret O'Sullivan, Boston, Massachusetts. Thomas stared at those words for a long time. A mail-order bride seemed like something desperate men did, not respectable ranchers. But what choice did he have? Winter was coming, and he couldn't manage the ranch and 3 children through another harsh Colorado winter alone. He wrote his first letter that very night, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight while his children slept. He told Margaret about his ranch, his children, and his need for a partner in life. He tried to be honest about his situation without sounding completely hopeless. Margaret's reply came 3 weeks later. Her handwriting was neat and educated, and her words were kind. She told him about her life in Boston, where she had cared for her elderly parents until they passed away. Now, at 28, she had few prospects and fewer choices. The big city had no place for a woman alone with no family connections. They exchanged letters for 2 months. Margaret wrote about her love of cooking and gardening. Thomas shared stories about ranch life and his children. Slowly, they built a friendship through their words on paper. Margaret even sent a photograph, showing a pleasant-faced woman in a dark dress standing beside a garden gate. When Thomas finally proposed marriage through a letter, Margaret accepted. She would take the train west, and they would marry as soon as she arrived. Thomas sent money for her ticket and tried not to think about how strange it was to marry a woman he had never met. The whole town buzzed with excitement when word spread that Thomas Whitmore was getting a mail-order bride. Some folks were supportive, saying it was high time he found help with those children. Others were less kind, making jokes about what kind of woman would answer such an advertisement. The day of Margaret's arrival, half the town gathered at the train station. Thomas stood nervously on the platform with his 3 children, all dressed in their Sunday best. He had told them they were getting a new mama, and they seemed excited but scared. When the train pulled in with a great cloud of steam and smoke, Thomas felt his heart pounding. He watched passengers step down from the cars looking for the woman from the photograph. Then he saw her. Margaret O'Sullivan stepped carefully down from the train, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing a simple brown traveling dress. She was considerably larger than her photograph had suggested, with round cheeks and a full figure that strained against her dress buttons. Thomas felt a moment of surprise, maybe even disappointment, but something about her gentle smile made him step forward. "Margaret?" he called out. "Thomas?" she replied, and her voice was warm and musical. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, 2 strangers who had agreed to spend their lives together. Thomas could hear whispers and giggles from the crowd behind him. Someone muttered something about getting more than he bargained for. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. But then little Annie started crying, overwhelmed by all the strange faces and noise. Without hesitation, Margaret knelt down in her traveling dress right there on the dusty platform and took the little girl's hands. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. "You must be Annie. Your papa has told me so much about you in his letters. Did you know that I brought something special just for you?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a small cloth doll with yellow yarn hair and a blue dress. Annie stopped crying and reached for the toy with wonder. "And Benjamin," Margaret continued, turning to the boy who was trying hard to look grown up. "I heard you're taking good care of your sisters. That makes you a very important young man." She handed him a carved wooden horse. "This was my brother's when he was your age." Baby Ruth was hiding behind Thomas's legs, but Margaret didn't force her attention. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "Hello, little Ruth. We're going to be great friends, you and I." Thomas watched this scene unfold and felt something shift in his chest. This kind woman was already thinking of his children's feelings instead of the embarrassing situation or the crowd's whispers. Maybe her photograph hadn't shown her true size, but it had captured something real in her eyes. Kindness. The wedding took place that very afternoon at the small church. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony while most of the town packed into the pews. Some came to offer support, but many came out of curiosity, like they were watching a show. Margaret had changed into her best dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, but she still looked nervous and out of place. Thomas wore his only suit, the one he had married Elizabeth in, and tried not to think about how different this wedding felt. During the ceremony, there were whispers and barely hidden laughter. Someone in the back made a comment about Thomas getting his money's worth, which made several people snicker. Thomas's face grew red with anger and shame, but Margaret seemed to ignore it all, focusing on the vows they were speaking. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd clapped politely, but the real moment came when they walked back down the aisle together. Little Annie was still crying, overwhelmed by the day's events. Margaret stopped right in the middle of the church and knelt down again, gathering the little girl in her arms. "Shh, my darling," she whispered. "It's going to be all right. Mama's here now." The word mama seemed to surprise everyone, including Margaret herself. But Annie stopped crying and laid her head against Margaret's shoulder. In that moment, something beautiful happened. Benjamin stepped closer and took Margaret's free hand. Even baby Ruth moved out from behind Thomas and touched Margaret's skirt. The whispers in the church changed tone. Instead of mockery, Thomas heard murmurs of surprise and maybe even approval. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely showed emotion, cleared his throat and looked away. Thomas realized that his new wife had just done something remarkable. In a room full of judgment and cruel whispers, she had made his children feel safe and loved. She had claimed them as her own without hesitation, even though she had known them for less than a day. As they walked out of the church together, Thomas, carrying Ruth while Margaret held Annie's hand and Benjamin walked beside them, they looked like a real family. The crowd followed them outside, and the mood had definitely shifted. People were smiling more genuinely now, and the comments were, "Kinder." Charlie Morrison slapped Thomas on the back and said, "You picked yourself a good one there, Thomas. Anyone can see she loves those children already." Mrs. Henderson approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. "Welcome to our community, dear. If you need anything at all, you just let me know." Even the men who had been making jokes earlier seemed more respectful now. There was something about watching Margaret with the children that had touched everyone's hearts. As they rode home in the wagon, the children chattered excitedly about their new mama and the gifts she had brought them. Margaret sat quietly beside Thomas, holding baby Ruth on her lap, while the little girl played with the wooden horse meant for Benjamin. "I'm sorry about some of the things people said today," Thomas said quietly. Margaret looked at him with those kind eyes that had first drawn him to her photograph. "People say things when they don't understand," she replied. "But your children are wonderful, Thomas. I can see why you love them so much." "They seem to have taken to you quickly," Thomas observed. Margaret smiled, and for the first time that day, she looked truly happy. Children know when someone cares about them. I meant what I said in church. I want to be their mama if they'll have me." As they approached the ranch house, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Maybe this arrangement would work out after all. Maybe Margaret's gentle heart was exactly what his family needed. Margaret woke up before dawn on her first morning as Mrs. Whitmore, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of ranch life. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the wind whistling through the gaps in the old house walls. Back in Boston, she had awakened to the sounds of carriages and street vendors. This was a completely different world. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, determined to prove herself useful from the very first day. Thomas had mentioned in his letters that breakfast was usually just coffee and whatever bread was left from the previous day. Margaret had different plans. By the time Thomas came in from the morning chores, the kitchen was filled with wonderful smells. Margaret had found flour and eggs and managed to create a feast from what seemed like nothing. Fresh biscuits, scrambled, eggs with wild onions she had found growing behind the house, and coffee that was actually strong and hot. "Good morning," she said shyly, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Thomas stopped in the doorway, surprised. "You didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Margaret replied. "A family should start the day with a good meal." The children came running when they smelled the food. Little Annie climbed right up on Margaret's lap while she ate, as if she had been doing it her whole life. Benjamin praised the biscuits and asked if she could teach him to make them. Even baby Ruth seemed more comfortable, babbling happily in her high chair. After breakfast, Margaret rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She had grown up helping with household tasks, but ranch life was different from city living. Everything was bigger, rougher, and more demanding. The house needed a deep cleaning, the vegetable garden was choked with weeds, and the children's clothes were patched beyond recognition. But Margaret didn't complain. She attacked each task with determination and surprising energy. By midday, she had cleaned the main room, started a load of washing, and begun weeding the garden. Thomas found her there during his lunch break, dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her forehead, but smiling as she worked. "You don't have to do everything in one day," he said gently. "I know," Margaret replied, sitting back on her heels. "But I want this to feel like home. For all of us." That afternoon, while the children napped, Margaret walked into town to introduce herself properly and buy supplies. She had saved a little money from her life in Boston, and she wanted to contribute to the household expenses. The reactions she received were mixed. Some of the women, like Mrs. Henderson, were genuinely welcoming. They offered advice about dealing with the harsh Colorado weather and invited her to join the church ladies' circle. But others were less friendly, whispering behind their hands and making comments they thought she couldn't hear. "I heard she's even bigger than she looked at the wedding," one woman said to another behind the fabric display. "Poor Thomas," came the reply. "He must have been desperate to settle for that." Margaret kept her head high and continued her shopping, but the words stung. She had always been larger than fashionable, even back in Boston, but she had hoped that in a place where hard work mattered more than appearances, she might find acceptance. At the general store, she overheard two men discussing Thomas's situation. "Can't believe he actually went through with marrying that cow," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Well, Whitmore was pretty desperate," the other replied. "Those kids needed someone, and beggars can't be choosers." Margaret's face burned with shame, but she completed her purchases with dignity. She bought fabric to make new clothes for the children, seeds for expanding the vegetable garden, and ingredients for hearty meals that would help Thomas build up his strength for the demanding ranch work. On her walk home, she discovered something that would change everything. Behind the old church, in a ramshackle building that used to be a school, she heard children's voices. Curious, she peered through a broken window and saw something that broke her heart. 5 children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, were huddled together around a small fire they had built in an old metal bucket. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces thin with hunger. They were sharing a single piece of bread that looked like it had been salvaged from someone's garbage. Margaret knocked gently on the door before entering. The children scattered like frightened animals, but she spoke softly. Please don't run. Away. I'm not here to cause trouble. The oldest child, a boy with dark hair and suspicious eyes, stepped forward. We ain't doing nothing wrong, lady. This building's been empty for years. I know, Margaret said gently. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I just moved here with my family. Are you children all right? You look like you could use a good meal. The children exchanged glances. Hunger won over caution. We're managing fine, the boy said, but his stomach chose that moment to growl loudly. Margaret learned that these were orphaned children who had been left behind when various tragedies struck their families. Mining accidents, disease, and simple abandonment had left them to fend for themselves. The town authorities knew they existed but considered them someone else's problem. Most folks just looked the other way. What are your names? Margaret asked, settling down on an old wooden crate to seem less threatening. The oldest boy was called Johnny. There was a girl about 10 named Lucy who seemed to be trying to mother the younger ones. The 3 little ones were Peter, Lily, and tiny Matthew, who couldn't have been more than 5. Margaret's heart ached looking at them. They reminded her of Thomas's children, but without the safety and love of a home. These little ones had no one to tuck them in at night, no one to make them breakfast, no one to worry when they didn't come home. Are you hungry? She asked, already knowing the answer. The children nodded eagerly. Margaret opened her shopping bag and pulled out the extra bread and cheese she had bought. She watched them devour the food like they hadn't eaten in days, which was probably true. Where do you sleep when it gets cold? Margaret asked Johnny. We got blankets, he said defensively, and we can make a fire when we need to. Margaret looked around the drafty building with its broken windows and leaking roof. These children would never survive a Colorado winter in this place. Listen, she said carefully. I live on a ranch just outside town. If you ever need a warm meal or a safe place to stay, you come find me. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore at the Whitmore Ranch. Can you remember that? The children nodded, but Johnny looked skeptical. Why would you help us? Most folks just tell us to move along. Because every child deserves to be cared for, Margaret said simply. And because I think we could help each other. She left them with all the extra food she had bought and promised to return soon. As she walked home, her mind was spinning with plans. She couldn't just leave those children to fend for themselves, but she also couldn't bring them home without talking to Thomas first. That evening, after the children were in bed, Margaret told Thomas about her discovery. She half expected him to be angry or worried about taking on more responsibilities, but instead, he listened thoughtfully. I've seen those kids around town, he said finally. Always wondered what happened to them. The authorities should be doing something. But they're not, Margaret replied. Thomas, they're living in that old building with no heat, no proper food, no one to care if they get sick or hurt. They're just babies. Thomas looked at his wife's face, seeing the determination and compassion there. What are you thinking, Margaret? I'm thinking that we have more room in this house than we're using. I'm thinking that children shouldn't go hungry when there are people who could help. And I'm thinking that maybe God brought me here for more than just taking care of your 3 little ones. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The ranch was already struggling financially. Adding more mouths to feed would make things even harder. But he had seen how Margaret cared for his own children, with a love that seemed endless and natural. If we did this, he said slowly, folks in town might not understand. They already think we're odd enough as it is. Margaret reached across the table and took his weathered hand in hers. Thomas, when I was a little girl, my grandmother used to say that we don't get to choose what size body we're born with, but we do get to choose what size heart we grow. Those children need someone to choose them. The next morning, Margaret packed a large basket with breakfast and returned to the abandoned building. She found the children exactly where she had left them, huddled together for warmth in the early morning chill. Good morning, she called out cheerfully. I brought breakfast. This time the children didn't run. They gathered around eagerly as Margaret unpacked hot biscuits, bacon, eggs, and fresh milk. She had also brought a jar of her homemade jam, which made little Lily clap her hands with delight. While they ate, Margaret talked to them about their lives. She learned that Johnny tried to find odd jobs to earn money for food, but most people wouldn't hire a child. Lucy did her best to keep the younger ones clean and safe. They all missed their families terribly but had learned not to talk about it because it made the little ones cry. "How would you feel about coming to stay at my ranch for a while?" Margaret asked carefully. "Just until we can figure out something more permanent." The children looked at each other with hope and fear. They had learned not to trust adults too much, but something about Margaret felt different. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the next morning, everyone knew that the Whitmore family had suddenly grown from 3 children to 8 overnight. Margaret could feel the stares and whispers following her as she walked through town with her expanded brood, buying supplies for their larger household. At the general store, conversations stopped when she entered. The store owner, Mr. Patterson, looked nervous as he watched the children spread out to explore the penny candy display. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I heard you've taken in some of the local strays." Margaret's back stiffened. "I've welcomed some children into our home, if that's what you mean. Now, don't get me wrong," Mr. Patterson continued. "It's Christian to help those less fortunate, but 8 children is a lot to feed. Are you sure you and Thomas can handle the expense?" Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Davidson, the banker's wife, joined the conversation. "Really, Margaret, you've only been here a few days. Don't you think you should focus on settling in with Thomas's children before taking on more responsibilities?" "These children needed help," Margaret replied firmly. "When you see someone in need, you don't wait for a more convenient time to care." "But dear," Mrs. Davidson continued with false sweetness, "what do you really know about these orphans? Some of them have been living wild for months. They might steal, or bring diseases, or corrupt your own children with bad habits." Little Lucy, who had been quietly holding baby Ruth's hand, looked up with tears in her eyes. Margaret immediately knelt down and put a protective arm around the girl. "These children," Margaret said loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear, "are good, honest, hard-working kids who deserve the same chances as any other child. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The store fell silent. Mrs. Davidson looked flustered, and Mr. Patterson busied himself with reorganizing items that didn't need reorganizing. Margaret completed her shopping with dignity, though her hands were shaking by the time they left. Outside, Johnny walked close to her side. "Mrs. Margaret, maybe we should go back to the old building. We don't want to cause trouble for you and Mr. Thomas." Margaret stopped walking and knelt down so she could look all the children in the eyes. "Listen to me, all of you. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. What other people think or say doesn't change that. We're a family and families stick together." But the criticism didn't stop there. Over the next few days, a steady stream of visitors came to the ranch, all with opinions about Margaret's decision. Mrs. Henderson, who had been one of Margaret's few supporters, arrived with a basket of muffins and a concerned expression. "Margaret, dear, I admire your generous heart, I truly do. But people are talking. They're saying you're being reckless taking in children you know nothing about. Some are even suggesting that Thomas should put his foot down before you bankrupt the family." Margaret served tea and tried to stay calm. "Mrs. Henderson, those children were starving and sleeping in a building with no heat. What was I supposed to do, pretend I didn't see them? But 8 children, Margaret, and winter's coming. How will you feed them all? How will you clothe them? And what about schooling?" These were all questions that kept Margaret awake at night, but she wasn't about to admit her fears to the townspeople, who seemed more interested in pointing out problems than offering solutions. The next visitor was even less welcome. Reverend Patterson arrived with 2 members of the town council, their faces serious and disapproving. "Mrs. Whitmore," Reverend Patterson began formally, "we've come to discuss your recent charitable activities." Thomas, who had been working nearby, came to stand beside his wife. "What about them?" Council member Mr. Bradley cleared his throat. "Thomas, we understand your wife means well, but taking in these vagrant children is causing concern in the community. Some of these orphans have been seen taking food from other people's gardens. One was caught sleeping in Mrs. Wilson's barn, without permission. They were hungry and cold," Margaret said firmly. "Before we took them in, they were doing whatever they had to do to survive." "That's exactly the problem." Mr. Bradley continued. These children have been living without rules or supervision. They don't understand proper behavior. What if they influence your own children badly? What if they steal from neighbors? The town has a reputation to maintain. Thomas felt his temper rising. Are you suggesting we throw hungry children back onto the streets to protect the town's reputation? Reverend Patterson tried a gentler approach. Thomas, Margaret, we're not heartless, but there are proper channels for dealing with orphaned children. The state has institutions designed for this purpose. You mean orphanages? Margaret said coldly. Where children are separated from siblings, given numbers instead of names, and worked like slaves until they're old enough to be thrown out with nothing. Now, Mrs. Whitmore, that's hardly fair. I've seen those places, Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. I volunteered at one in Boston. Children packed into dormitories like cattle, fed thin gruel and stale bread, lucky to get a kind word once a week. Is that what you want for Johnny and Lucy and little Matthew? The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. They hadn't expected such passion from the quiet woman who had arrived just days ago. Mr. Bradley tried again. Mrs. Whitmore, we appreciate your concern, but you have to be practical. You and Thomas are struggling to make ends meet as it is. Adding 5 more mouths to feed, 5 more bodies to clothe, it's not sustainable. You'll end up losing your ranch, and then where will any of the children be? This hit closer to home because Margaret had the same fears. She and Thomas had talked late into the night about money and resources. The ranch was barely profitable, with their small family. 8 children would strain everything to the breaking point, but before she could respond, something unexpected happened. Johnny stepped out from behind the kitchen door where he had been listening. Excuse me, sir, he said politely to Mr. Bradley. I couldn't help hearing what you said about us being a burden. The adults all turned to look at the thin, serious-faced boy. Johnny, you don't need to, Margaret began. No, Mrs. Margaret, I want to say this. Johnny looked directly at the men. Me and Lucy and the others, we're not just mouths to feed. We can work. I'm 12, and I'm strong. I can help Mr. Thomas with the ranch work. Lucy's real good with the little ones, and she can cook and clean. Even Peter and Lily can help with small jobs. He paused, then continued with quiet dignity. We don't want to be burdens on anybody, but we also don't want to be split up and sent to different places where we'll never see each other again. Mrs. Margaret and Mr. Thomas are giving us a chance to stay together and have a real home. That's worth working hard for. The men looked uncomfortable under the boy's steady gaze. Here was a child speaking more maturely than most adults they knew. Thomas stepped forward and put his hand on Johnny's shoulder. That's right, son. We're not just taking in charity cases. We're gaining family members who contribute to our home. Over the following weeks, the children proved Johnny's words true. The older ones threw themselves into ranch work with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Johnny learned to milk cows and repair fences. Lucy helped Margaret with cooking and minding the younger children. Even little Peter gathered eggs and fed chickens with careful attention. But the real test came when the first early blizzard of the season struck without warning. Margaret was in town with baby Ruth when the snow began falling heavily. By the time she realized how bad the storm was getting, the wind was howling and visibility was nearly zero. Thomas was out checking on cattle when the storm hit. The older children were at the ranch house with the little ones, but Margaret knew they would be frightened without any adults there. She also knew that trying to drive the wagon home in this weather could be deadly. Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for weeks afterward. She left Ruth with Mrs. Henderson and set out on foot for the ranch, following the road by memory and feel more than sight. The wind was so strong it knocked her down several times. Snow clung to her coat and skirt, making every step harder. She was nearly frozen and completely lost when she heard voices calling her name. Through the swirling snow, she saw lights moving toward her. Thomas appeared like a guardian angel, followed by Johnny and Lucy carrying lanterns. Margaret. Thank God. Thomas wrapped her in his coat and half-carried her toward home. What were you thinking walking in this storm? The children, she gasped through chattering teeth. I was worried about the children. They're fine, Thomas assured her. Johnny kept everyone calm. Lucy made soup for dinner, and they had all, the little ones playing games by the fire when I got back. But Margaret's ordeal wasn't over. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and fear had taken its toll. By the time they reached the house, she was burning with fever and could barely stand. For 3 days, Margaret lay unconscious while Thomas and the children took turns sitting by her bedside. The doctor came from town, despite the continuing bad weather, shaking his head at her condition. "She's very sick," he told Thomas privately. "The fever's too high and she's been fighting it too long. I've done what I can, but..." 2 years had passed since Margaret's near-death experience in the blizzard, and the Whitmore Ranch had transformed into something no one could have imagined. What started as a desperate arrangement between strangers had grown into a thriving home filled with love, laughter, and purpose. The house itself had grown too. Thomas and the older boys had added 2 more bedrooms and expanded the kitchen to accommodate their large family. The vegetable garden that Margaret tended had tripled in size, producing enough food to feed everyone and still have surplus to trade in town. The barn housed more livestock than ever before, thanks to the children's help with the daily chores. But the biggest change was in the children themselves. Johnny, now 14, had grown tall and strong from ranch work and good food. He could handle a team of horses as well as any adult, and had developed a reputation in town as one of the most reliable workers anyone could hire. Neighbors often requested his help during busy seasons, and he always shared his earnings with the family. Lucy had blossomed into a confident young woman of 12, with a natural talent for managing the household and caring for the younger children. She could cook a meal for 10 people, mend torn clothes with neat stitches, and tell bedtime stories that kept even the most restless child spellbound. Margaret often said that Lucy was the heart of their home. The younger children had thrived. 2, Peter, now 9, had discovered a gift for working with animals. Even the most stubborn cow would calm down when Peter talked to her in his gentle voice. 7-year-old Lily had appointed herself the family's artist, decorating their home with drawings and wildflower arrangements that brought beauty to every room. Little Matthew, though still small for his age, had grown into a cheerful, talkative child who followed the older boys around like a devoted puppy. And Thomas's original children had adjusted beautifully to their expanded family. Annie, now 6, couldn't remember a time before her adopted siblings. Benjamin treated Johnny like the older brother he had always wanted. Baby Ruth, now 5, spoke of all the children as her brothers and sisters without any distinction. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been arguments, tears, and moments when Margaret wondered if she had bitten off more than she could chew. 8 children meant 8 different personalities, 8 sets of needs, and 8 times the normal amount of childhood drama. There was the time Johnny and Benjamin got into a fist fight over whose turn it was to use the good fishing pole. Margaret found them rolling around in the dirt behind the barn, both sporting black eyes and torn clothes. Instead of punishing them, she sat them down and made them explain to each other why the fishing pole was so important to them. It turned out Johnny had never owned anything nice before coming to live with them, and having his turn with the good pole made him feel like he truly belonged. Benjamin, on the other hand, was feeling left out because Johnny was getting better at ranch work and earning praise from Thomas. The fishing pole was his way of proving he was still important too. Once they understood each other's feelings, the boys worked out a sharing schedule and even started teaching the younger children how to fish. Margaret learned that day that sometimes the best solutions came from listening rather than lecturing. There was also the incident when Lucy tried to take over all the cooking because she thought Margaret was working too hard. For 3 days, Lucy insisted on preparing every meal while Margaret was banned from the kitchen. The results were mixed. The bread came out flat, the stew was too salty, and somehow she managed to burn water while boiling eggs. Finally, Lily tearfully announced that she missed Mama Margaret's cooking and couldn't eat another one of Lucy's biscuits because they were harder than rocks. Lucy burst into tears, thinking she had failed as a helper. Margaret gathered Lucy in her arms and explained that wanting to help was wonderful, but trying to do everything alone was a mistake she had made too. From that day on, they cooked together, with Lucy learning Margaret's recipes and techniques, while Margaret learned to appreciate Lucy's creative additions to familiar dishes. The most challenging situation came when a new family moved to town and their son, Robert, started bullying little Matthew at school. Robert was bigger and older, and he seemed to enjoy picking on the smallest Whitmore child. He would knock Matthew's books out of his hands, steal his lunch, and call him names like orphan trash and charity case. Matthew tried to hide what was happening, but Margaret noticed his torn clothes, missing food, and the way he dreaded going to school each morning. When she finally got the truth out of him, her maternal instincts flared like nothing she had ever experienced. Margaret marched into town and found Robert's mother, Mrs. Franklin, at the general store. With half the town watching, she politely but firmly explained the situation. "Mrs. Franklin, I believe your son Robert has been bothering my Matthew at school. I'm sure it's just boys being boys, but I wanted to make sure you knew so you could talk to him about treating smaller children with kindness." Mrs. Franklin looked embarrassed but defensive. "Well, maybe if your boy wasn't so different, he wouldn't attract trouble. Children can tell when someone doesn't really belong." Margaret's eyes flashed dangerously. "Matthew belongs in this town just as much as any other child. He belongs in our family just as much as any other child. And he deserves to go to school without being hurt by bullies." "Now see here," Mrs. Franklin began, but Margaret wasn't finished. "If Robert continues to bother Matthew, I'll be having a conversation with his father, and if that doesn't solve the problem, I'll be talking to the schoolmaster about children who make others feel unsafe in what should be a place of learning." Word of Margaret's confrontation spread quickly. Some people admired her fierce protection of her children. Others thought she was being too aggressive over normal childhood squabbles. But Robert never bothered Matthew again, and other children learned that the Whitmore kids had a mother who wouldn't hesitate to stand up for them. These incidents taught Margaret something important about raising a large family. Each child needed individual attention and understanding, but they also needed to see that they were all equally valued and protected. It wasn't enough to provide food and shelter. She had to create an environment where every child felt secure, in their place in the family. The community's attitude toward the Whitmore family had changed dramatically over the 2 years. What started as skepticism and gossip had gradually transformed into admiration and respect. People began to see the results of Margaret and Thomas's approach to child rearing. The Whitmore children were known throughout the town as polite, hardworking, and helpful. Johnny was requested by name when neighbors needed assistance with difficult tasks. Lucy volunteered at the church and helped elderly residents with their shopping. Even the youngest children were praised for their good manners and cheerful dispositions. During the previous summer's harvest season, when the Peterson family lost their barn to a lightning strike, the Whitmore children had organized other young people in town to help rebuild it. They worked for days in the hot sun, refusing any payment except for Mrs. Peterson's lemonade and praise. When old Mr. Davidson broke his leg and couldn't tend his garden, little Peter and Lily showed up every morning to water his vegetables and pull weeds. They brought him fresh flowers and entertained him with stories about their family's daily adventures. These acts of kindness weren't assigned as chores or done for recognition. The children had learned from Margaret and Thomas that helping others was simply part of being a good person. Their generosity came naturally because it's what they had experienced themselves. The most significant change in community perception came when a traveling preacher visited their church one Sunday. Reverend Williams was known throughout the territory for his powerful sermons and his ability to see the spiritual condition of a community. After the service, he approached Thomas and Margaret with tears in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I want to thank you for allowing me to witness something truly beautiful today." Margaret looked puzzled. "I'm not sure what you mean, Reverend." "I watched your children during the service. I watched how the older ones helped the younger ones find the right pages in their hymnals. I watched how they shared their collection money without being asked. I watched how they listened to the sermon with genuine interest, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to learn." He paused, looking around at their large family group. "But most of all, I watched how they looked at you and your husband. The love and respect in their eyes is unmistakable. These children don't just live in your house, Mrs. Whitmore. They truly belong to your family." Reverend Williams's words spread throughout the congregation and beyond. People began to understand that what was happening at the Whitmore Ranch wasn't just charity or Christian duty. It was something much rarer and more precious, the creation of genuine family bonds that transcended blood relationships. Local families started seeking Margaret's advice about child-rearing problems. How did she manage 8 children without constant chaos? How did she teach them to work together instead of fighting? How did she help each child feel special when she couldn't possibly give individual attention to everyone all the time? The summer of Margaret's 5th year in Colorado brought the worst drought anyone could remember. The sky remained a harsh, cloudless blue day after day, while the sun beat down mercilessly on crops that withered and died. Rivers that had never gone dry became dusty beds of cracked earth. Wells that had served families for generations gave up only sand and stones. The Whitmore Ranch, like every other farm and ranch in the valley, faced ruin. The vegetable garden that had fed their large family and provided surplus to sell in town produced almost nothing. The pastures turned brown and brittle, forcing Thomas to sell most of their cattle before they starved. The creek that supplied their water dropped to a trickle that barely filled a bucket. Other families in the area began making desperate plans. Some talked of selling their land and moving back east. Others spoke of sending their children to relatives in different states until the drought ended. The general store cut credit for most families, and the bank stopped making new loans. But instead of hoarding what little they had, Margaret and Thomas made a decision that shocked their neighbors. They opened their doors even wider. It started when Mrs. Peterson, now a widow, came to their door with tears streaming down her face. Her small garden had failed completely, and she had no money left to buy food from the store. "Margaret," she said, her voice breaking with shame, "I never thought I'd have to ask for help from anyone, but I haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and I don't know where to turn." Margaret immediately brought her inside and set a place at their dinner table. "Mrs. Peterson, you helped us when we first arrived here. You gave Lucy fabric to make new dresses and taught Johnny how to properly shoe a horse. This family doesn't forget kindness. But you have so many mouths to feed already," Mrs. Peterson protested. "I can't take food from your children." Johnny, now 16 and tall as his father, spoke up from across the table. "Mrs. Peterson, you're not taking anything from us. When people share what they have, somehow there's always enough." Word spread that the Whitmore family was still helping their neighbors despite their own struggles. Soon, other desperate families began appearing at their door. The Williams family arrived after their well went completely dry, carrying their 3 young children and everything they owned in a single wagon. Margaret took one look at the exhausted family and immediately began organizing sleeping arrangements. "Lucy, help me move the little ones into our room. Johnny, you and Benjamin clear out the storage room and set up beds. Thomas, we need to expand the dinner table again." "Mrs. Margaret," Mr. Williams said awkwardly, "we can't pay you anything. We lost everything when the crops failed." "Did I ask for payment?" Margaret replied briskly. "This is what neighbors do for each other. When times are good, you'll help someone else who needs it." By the end of July, the Whitmore house sheltered 17 people. In addition to their own 8 children, they had taken in Mrs. Peterson, the Williams family, old Mr. Davidson, whose arthritis made it impossible for him to care for himself, and 2 young families whose ranches had been foreclosed by the bank. Feeding 17 people when food was scarce required creativity and careful planning that would have defeated many households. But Margaret had learned to stretch every ingredient and waste nothing. Soup bones were boiled until they fell apart, then ground up for flour extender. Wild greens were gathered from areas that still had some moisture. Even potato peels were cleaned, seasoned, and fried into crispy treats that the children loved. Lucy had become Margaret's partner in managing their expanded household. At 14, she could plan meals for days ahead, organize work schedules so that everyone contributed according to their abilities, and settle disputes between children who were feeling stressed by the overcrowded conditions. But it was Margaret's leadership that held everything together. She maintained rules that kept the household running smoothly while making sure everyone felt welcomed rather than merely tolerated. She assigned jobs that gave each person a sense of purpose and contribution. Most importantly, she created an atmosphere where temporary hardship felt like an adventure rather than a disaster. We're like pioneers, she told the children one evening, as they all sat around the expanded dinner table, sharing a meal of wild green soup and cornbread made with ground acorns. Pioneers had to work together and help each other to survive. That's what we're doing. Will we always live like this? Mama Margaret, little Annie asked. At 8 years old, she could barely remember a time when the house wasn't full of extra people. No, sweetheart. The drought will end eventually, and people will be able to go back to their own homes. But the important thing we're learning is that we can take care of each other when times are hard. The community's attitude toward Margaret had undergone a complete transformation. The same people who had once whispered cruel comments about the plump mail-order bride now looked to her for leadership and wisdom. When the town council met to discuss how to handle the crisis, they invited Margaret to join their discussions. Mrs. Whitmore, said Mr. Bradley, the same council member who had once criticized her for taking in orphans, you've managed to keep more families fed and housed than anyone else in town. How are you doing it? Margaret looked around the table, at the worried faces of men who had once questioned her judgment. It's simple, she said. When you stop thinking about what you don't have and start thinking about what you can share, you discover that there's usually enough. But surely you must be struggling financially, pressed Mr. Franklin. Feeding and housing all those people. It must be costing you everything. Thomas, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke. We're not getting rich, that's certain, but we're not going hungry either. When everyone works together and contributes what they can, the load gets lighter, not heavier. Margaret nodded. Mrs. Williams is an excellent seamstress. She's been mending everyone's clothes and even making new ones from fabric scraps. Mr. Davidson knows more about preserving food than anyone in town, and he's been teaching us techniques that have saved everything we've managed to grow. The older children help with all the ranch work, which means we can maintain the property, even though times are hard. Most importantly, she continued, when people feel like they belong somewhere, like they're valued and needed, they want to contribute. Nobody in our house feels like a burden because everyone has something important to offer. The town council was so impressed with Margaret's approach that they asked her to help organize relief efforts for other struggling families. Soon her method of combining resources and sharing responsibilities was being copied throughout the valley. But the real test of Margaret's leadership came in September, when word arrived that a wealthy businessman from Denver was planning to visit their town. Mr. Harrison had been investigating locations for a new railroad depot that would bring jobs and prosperity to whatever community he chose. The town council was desperate to make a good impression. They organized committees to clean up the main street, paint building fronts, and prepare presentations about their town's advantages. But they were also worried about how their current situation would look to a sophisticated city businessman. What if he sees all the failed crops and empty houses? Worried Mrs. Davidson. What if he thinks we're a community that can't handle prosperity? What if he notices all the families living in temporary arrangements? Added Mr. Bradley. He might think we're disorganized or unstable. Margaret listened to their concerns with growing frustration. Finally, she stood up at the town meeting and addressed the entire gathering. Friends, I understand you want to make a good impression on Mr. Harrison, but are you planning to hide the truth about what's happening here? Are you going to pretend that we haven't been struggling with the worst drought in memory? The room fell silent. People looked uncomfortable, but no one answered. Margaret continued, I think you're missing something important. Yes, we've been hit hard by the drought. Yes, some families have lost their homes and ranches. But look at how we've responded. Look at how we've come together to help each other survive. She gestured toward families sitting together in the meeting hall. Mrs. Peterson isn't just surviving because of charity. She's contributing her skills and knowledge to help other families. The Williams children aren't just taking up space in someone else's home. They're working and learning and becoming stronger because they're part of a community that values them. Don't you see? Margaret's voice grew stronger with conviction. The drought didn't break us. It showed us who we really are. It proved that this is a community where people don't abandon each other when times get hard. Isn't that exactly the kind of character that any businessman would want to see in a town he's considering for investment? When Mr. Harrison arrived the following week, the townspeople were nervous but ready. They gave him the planned tour of their main street and presented their prepared speeches about the advantages of their location. But the moment that changed everything happened when he visited the Whitmore Ranch. Margaret had been chosen to prepare lunch for the distinguished visitor, and she had decided to show him exactly what their community was really like.